The termination letter was already signed when the millionaire's 7-year-old blind son stepped into the hallway and said, "She reads to me." His father froze, the pen hovering over the document that would fire their live-in maid without cause. The boy, who navigated the mansion by memory and sound, shouldn't have known about the envelope. He shouldn't have known she was being sent away in the middle of the night. Sarah had been the Thorns' live-in caregiver for 3 years, hired to maintain a 14,000-square-foot estate. But in the eyes of the law, she was an at-will employee able to be dismissed at any moment, for any reason or for no reason at all. Her severance, a single week's pay and 30 minutes to pack. Yet according to a blind child who sees the world through sound and touch, she wasn't just cleaning. She was keeping a secret promise every single night after midnight. So what does a 7-year-old boy know that a powerful millionaire does not? David Thorne built his fortune on a simple principle: eliminate inefficiency. He saw his son's blindness not as a tragedy, but as a logistical problem to be managed with precision. His $38 million Bel Air home was a system. Leo, his 7-year-old, had a schedule: therapy from 9 to 11, audio lessons from 1 to 3, structured play until 5. Sarah Miller's role was to maintain the machine, laundry, meals, ensuring Leo's world remained sterile and silent. She was paid $900 a week, cash, with no contract, no health insurance, and a small maid's quarters behind the kitchen. In the eyes of California's labor board, she was practically a ghost. But systems have leaks. David first noticed one in the financial statements. Over 3 months, household expenses crept up by almost $2,000, not a fortune but an anomaly. Unexplained charges for deliveries after 10 p.m., receipts for art supplies he never authorized, a new premium audiobook subscription. When he confronted Sarah, she looked at the floor, her hands tucked into the sleeves of her uniform. "It's for Leo's development, Mr. Thorne." The therapist suggested some supplemental materials. David's security system, a network of silent cameras covering every hallway and common room, showed nothing out of order. Just Sarah working, Leo in his room, yet the feeling remained: a disruption in the data. Leo Thorne lived in a world of textures and echoes. He memorized the number of steps from his bedroom to the top of the staircase: 22. He knew the smell of rain on the courtyard tiles 10 minutes before anyone else, and he knew Sarah's footsteps, softer than his father, always pausing outside his door. After his mother passed away 3 years prior, a succession of nannies and aides had come and gone, their voices blurring into a single hum of pity. Then Sarah arrived. She didn't speak to him like he was broken. She placed his hand on the dough when she baked, let him feel the vibration of the washing machine, described the color of the sunset as the warmth on your cheek when you turn toward the window. She was a constant in a dark, shifting world. The official reason for termination was violation of household financial protocols. David drafted the letter himself. He would be calm, surgical. He'd give her the legally required 30 days of lodging and 2 weeks of severance, though he suspected she wouldn't fight it. People like her never did. On the night he called her into his study, the house was quiet. Leo was supposed to be asleep. David slid the envelope across his polished oak desk. "Your services are no longer required, effective immediately. You have 30 minutes to collect your belongings from the quarters." Sarah's face didn't collapse. It went still, like a pond freezing over. She didn't reach for the envelope. "Leo," she said quietly, "he has a lesson at 10. That's when the study door, which had been left ajar, swung open. Leo stood in the hallway, his small hand on the doorframe, his head tilted as if listening to a distant frequency. He wore pajamas, his blonde hair mussed, his dark glasses reflecting the cold light of the study. "She reads to me," he said, his voice clear in the thick silence. David stood up, his chair scraping back. "Leo, go to your room. This is not your concern." But the boy took a small step forward, navigating the space between furniture with unconscious grace. "You said she was stealing," Leo stated. "You told Mr. Jenkins on the phone, but she was here every night. She reads the old books from the library, the ones with the bumpy pages." David's blood went cold. Mr. Jenkins was his attorney. That call had taken place in his private car with the partition up. There was no way Leo could have overheard, unless— David's eyes snapped to Sarah. She was looking at Leo, her expression a raw mix of dread and something else, pride. "What is he talking about?" David's voice was low, dangerous. "The Braille books," Leo answered for her. "The ones that belonged to Mom. Sarah found them in the boxes in the attic." After you sleep, she reads them to me. She's teaching me. David Thorne had donated all of his late wife's Braille books to a charity 18 months ago, or so he thought. He had signed the form, gotten the tax receipt. They were supposed to be gone, a relic of a life he was systematically archiving. Sarah finally spoke, her eyes still on the boy. He asked about them. He remembered the feel of them. I called the charity. I bought them back with my own money. The unexplained expenses, the late deliveries, it wasn't theft. It was a restitution David had never authorized, a reanimation of a past he had ordered deleted. You overstepped, David whispered, the fury banked but glowing. You imported chaos into my house. He picked up the termination letter and held it out. This time Sarah took it. Her fingers left a faint smudge on the crisp white paper. As she turned to leave, Leo made a small, desperate sound and reached out. His hand found her wrist. You said we'd finish the story tonight, he said, his lower lip trembling, the one about the knight who sees with his hands. Sarah knelt, her uniform brushing the floor. She pulled Leo into a tight hug, whispering something into his hair that David, standing 5 feet away, could not hear. Then she stood, walked out of the study, and did not look back. 30 minutes later, David watched from his bedroom window as a rideshare car pulled away, carrying Sarah Miller and one small suitcase into the California night. The system was restored, efficiency maintained. He walked down the 22 steps to Leo's room. The boy was sitting on his bed, facing the wall, perfectly motionless. She's gone, Leo. It was necessary. Leo didn't respond. David noticed something on the bedside table. Not one of the modern, electronic Braille readers he'd purchased, but an old, cloth-bound volume. He picked it up. His wife's name was embossed on the inside cover. He dropped it like it was hot. Where did you get this? Leo finally turned his head. She left it for the midnight lesson, but I can't read it alone yet. David's phone buzzed. A notification from his security system. Motion detected in the East Wing hallway. At 1:15 in the morning, he opened the live feed. The hallway was empty, but the timestamp glowed back at him. This was a recorded alert from the previous night. He played it. The black and white footage showed Sarah in her uniform leaving her quarters. She walked past the camera, carrying a blanket and the old book. She entered Leo's room. The timestamp ticked over for 54 minutes before she emerged again, every single night for the past month. A secret ritual he had paid for but never mandated. A line item that had never appeared on any report. David scrolled back further. 2 months. 3. The pattern was relentless. He sat down heavily on his son's bed, the phone slack in his hand. He had fired her for a crime she didn't commit. While missing the one she did, she had made his son love her. And in doing so, she had given Leo a secret he was now guarding. The boy's hand found his father's. She said you wouldn't understand, Leo whispered. She said some people can only see what's missing. David stared at the frozen image on his phone, Sarah, caught in the hallway's gloom, a silhouette against the vast, empty house. He had just removed a critical component from his own system, and he had absolutely no idea what it was truly doing. The first call David Thorne made wasn't to his attorney, it was to his head of security, a former intelligence analyst named Carl Renner. I want a full background on Sarah Miller, everything, where she banks, who she calls, what she did before she came here, and I want it by sunrise. David spent the next 2 hours in his study, scrolling through months of security archives. The pattern was undeniable. Sarah entered Leo's room every night between 12:45 and 1:15 a.m. She stayed for an average of 52 minutes. On the footage, Leo was always awake, sitting up in bed, his small hands moving across the pages of a book as she read aloud. David had purchased state-of-the-art assistive technology, a $5,000 audio reader that could access any digital library. Leo had refused to use it. He wanted the books with the bumps. He wanted Sarah's voice. By 4 a.m., Carl Renner delivered a preliminary file. Sarah Miller, age 32, born in Fresno, nursing school dropout, worked as a home health aide for 6 years before taking the live-in position with the Thorns. No criminal record. A single bank account with a balance that rarely exceeded $2,000. But there was an anomaly. For the past 8 months, she had been making monthly electronic payments of $400 to something listed as the Havenbrook Center. David searched it. A private, non-profit residential facility for adults with profound visual and intellectual disabilities. Located 90 miles north. He stared at the screen. Why would an underpaid maid be sending nearly a third of her income to a place like that? At 6 a.m., David marched into Leo's room. The boy was already dressed, sitting on the edge of his bed, facing the window. "Leo," David said, his voice tighter than he intended. "The reading, what else did you and Sarah do at night?" Leo turned his head slowly. "You watch the cameras, you already know. I know what the cameras show, I want to know what they don't." Leo was silent for a long moment. "We practiced," he finally said. "Practiced what?" "Getting out," Leo whispered. David's blood went cold. "What do you mean, getting out?" "If there was a fire," Leo said, his voice flat, rehearsed. "My door to the hall is 22 steps, but if the hall is smoky, the window is 3 steps from the bed. She measured it with me every night. We counted the steps. We felt for the latch. She said a plan you only practice in the daylight is a plan you'll forget in the dark." David sat down heavily on the bed. The fire alarm system in the house was top of the line, connected directly to the fire department. He had never once considered that Leo would need a separate tactile escape plan. It was a gap in the system, one Sarah had identified and quietly filled. She hadn't just been reading stories, she had been running drills. "Why didn't she tell me?" Leo shrugged, a small, heartbreaking gesture. "She said you buy solutions. You don't like problems you didn't find first." The words landed with the precision of a scalpel. David left his son's room and went directly to the attic. The storage boxes labeled Claire's things had been neatly retaped. He ripped one open. Inside, alongside his late wife's Braille novels, were other items. A set of plastic texture cards for teaching tactile discrimination. A simple Braille label maker. A folder containing printed articles on cortical visual impairment and non-visual spatial mapping. These weren't just mementos, they were tools, and they had been used. David's attorney, Mr. Jenkins, arrived at 8. He listened stone-faced as David laid out the situation, the termination, the security footage, the payments to Havenbrook. "You're concerned about a wrongful termination suit?" Jenkins asked, adjusting his glasses. "I'm concerned I made a mistake," David said, the admission tasting like ash. Jenkins opened his tablet. "The mistake was procedural, David. You dismissed a domestic employee without written warning for a cause you can't substantiate. The financial protocol's argument is weak if she used her own money for the items. California's Domestic Worker Bill of Rights means she could have overtime claims. Live-in, working nights. The state could easily construe those midnight sessions as work hours. The back pay alone." He tapped the screen, calculating. "If a labor board argues she was on call or performing duties during those night hours, you could be looking at tens of thousands in unpaid wages, penalties, fines." David waved a hand, dismissing the money. "What about Havenbrook? Why is she sending them money?" Jenkins peered at the report. "That is unusual, but it's her finances, not your concern unless it's illegal." "Make it your concern," David said. "Find out." David's next meeting was with Dr. Anya Sharma, Leo's developmental therapist. He showed her snippets of the security footage. Dr. Sharma watched, her expression shifting from professional curiosity to something akin to awe. "She's co-regulating with him," the doctor said. "Look at her posture. She's mirroring his breathing. She's letting him lead with his hands. This isn't just reading, this is deep-touch therapeutic engagement." "Where did she train?" "She didn't," David said. "She's a maid." Dr. Sharma shook her head firmly. "No, she is using techniques from guided tactile exploration therapy. They're used for children with CVI. This is specialized. Who is she?" That was the question now haunting David Thorne. Who was Sarah Miller, really? The answer began to crack open at 2 that afternoon. Carl Renner called, his usual calm replaced by a focused urgency. "Sir, I dug deeper on Havenbrook. It's a full care facility. One of their long-term residents is a 40-year-old female named Elena Miller, admitted 12 years ago following a traumatic brain injury that resulted in total blindness and significant cognitive impairment." David's mind raced. "Miller, relative, younger sister," Carl confirmed. "Sarah Miller is her sole legal guardian and only living family. The $400 payments are her contribution to a supplemental care fund. The basic care is covered by state aid, but it's sparse." David closed his eyes. The maid's uniform, the cracked hands, the quiet exhaustion, it wasn't just from cleaning his house. It was from a life split in two, holding together the fragile existence of a sister in a facility 90 miles away with the money she earned washing his windows. But Carl wasn't finished. "There's more. I tracked her movements on her one weekly day off. For the last 18 months, every Thursday she took a bus to Havenbrook. She spent 4 hours there, then she took a second bus to the UCLA Braille Institute. She didn't go inside. She met someone in the cafe across the street, a woman in her 60s. I ran the plate on her car. David's grip tightened on the phone. Who? Dr. Lydia Vance, retired. Former clinical director of pediatric visual impairment services at the UCLA Stein Eye Institute. She was also, briefly, a consultant for your wife, Claire, in the year before her passing. They worked on developing a customized intervention plan for Leo. The room seemed to tilt. David remembered Dr. Vance. Claire had mentioned her, a brilliant specialist who thought outside the box. Claire had died suddenly in a car accident before any formal plan could be implemented. David, in his grief, had filed all of it away, another unfinished project of his wife's that was too painful to confront. What were they doing? David asked, his voice hoarse. Based on the duration and regularity, I'd say training, Carl said. Sarah Miller was receiving instruction from one of the leading experts in the field, paid for out of her own pocket, on her only day off. She wasn't just following a therapist's suggestion, she was becoming one for your son. The pieces slammed together with brutal force. Sarah hadn't stumbled into this. She had sought it out. She had used her position, her access, to resurrect his wife's unfinished mission. Every night spent reading Braille wasn't a secret act of kindness. It was the deliberate execution of a professional care plan designed by his late wife and supervised by her chosen expert, all happening under his roof without his knowledge. He had fired her for stealing, when in truth, she had been investing everything, her money, her time, her spirit, into his child. The injustice of it was a physical weight on his chest. David drove to the Braille Institute. He found Dr. Lydia Vance in the cafe, exactly as Carl had described, reading a medical journal. He introduced himself. The old woman looked up, her gaze sharp and unforgiving. David Thorne, I wondered if this day would come. You've been training my maid, he said, the word maid feeling grotesque and inadequate as he said it. I've been mentoring a remarkably dedicated woman who is gifted with nonverbal children, Dr. Vance corrected. Your wife, Claire, contacted me shortly before she died. She was worried. She said you were a brilliant strategist, but you grieved by eliminating variables. She feared you would eliminate Leo's blindness by trying to wish it away rather than engaging with it. She wanted to build a bridge for him, a way to connect his world to yours. Sarah was to be that bridge. David felt the air leave his lungs. Claire hired her. No, Claire found her. Sarah was working at Havenbrook caring for her sister. Claire volunteered there. She saw the way Sarah worked with the residents, with patience, with touch, with silence. She saw a natural aptitude that no degree could confer. They made a plan. Claire would fund Sarah's mentorship with me, and Sarah would come work for you to be there for Leo as he grew. Then Claire died. The funding died with her. But Sarah showed up at my door anyway. She said she'd made a promise. She paid for the sessions herself, week after week. She told me you didn't know. She said you wouldn't approve. It seems she was right. David returned to his car, but he didn't drive home. He sat in the parking lot, the doctor's words etching themselves into his mind. She said you wouldn't approve. He had built a fortress of control, and he had just expelled its most vital guardian. His phone buzzed. It was Mr. Jenkins. David, I've heard from the California Labor Commissioner's office. A complaint has been filed. It's not from Sarah Miller. Who then? A nonprofit advocacy group called the Domestic Workers Justice Project. They're representing her. They're not just alleging wrongful termination. They're alleging wage theft for all those undocumented night hours, and they're requesting punitive damages for what they're calling emotional distress inflicted upon a vulnerable child. They've asked for an emergency hearing. David stared out the windshield. When? Tomorrow at 10 a.m. The system was now turning against its architect. But as David finally started the engine, one thought overrode the legal dread. Sarah had a sister at Havenbrook, a sister who depended on her, and he had just cut off her income. Where was she right now? And what desperate thing might a person do when the last thread holding their world together is suddenly severed? Sarah Miller was not at the women's shelter, or the bus station, or any of the addresses Carl Renner could find. She had vanished with her one suitcase into the city's vast anonymity. But the system David built to protect his family had one final, brutal lesson to teach him. At 7 p.m., the alert chimed on his phone. Motion detected at the Havenbrook Center. The facial recognition software, licensed for his home security, had been illegally ported by Carl into public traffic cameras along the route to the facility. It had flagged Sarah's face boarding a northbound bus. She was going to her sister. David didn't call the police. He got in his car and drove. The Havenbrook Center was a single-story complex that smelled of antiseptic and overcooked vegetables. The night nurse at the front desk, wary, told him visiting hours were over. David slid a business card across the counter. "I'm looking for Sarah Miller. It's urgent. Her sister's welfare may depend on it." The nurse's eyes flickered with recognition. "Elena's sister? She's in room 12, but there's a gentleman from the billing office with her, has been for 20 minutes. David didn't wait for permission. He followed the numbered doors to room 12. The door was ajar. He heard Sarah's voice, strained but steady. "I have the 400. It's right here. The next payment isn't due until the 15th. A man's voice, clipped and impatient, replied, "Miss Miller, that's for the supplemental fund. I'm here about the base residency fee. The state's contribution was adjusted downward last month. There's a new copay, $800 monthly, effective immediately. If it's not settled, we'll have to initiate transfer proceedings to a state facility by the end of the week." David stepped into the doorway. The room was small, dominated by a hospital bed. A woman who looked like an older, vacant-eyed version of Sarah lay still, connected to a feeding pump. Sarah stood between the bed and a man in a cheap suit, clutching a handful of crumpled bills. She looked at David, and the shock on her face was immediately replaced by a fierce, protective anger. "Get out." David ignored her, addressing the billing man. "What's the total arrears?" The man blinked. "Who are you?" "The person paying the bill. What's the total?" The man consulted his tablet. "With the new copay, $800 for this month, plus a one-time processing fee of $150, $950 total." David pulled out his wallet and removed a $1,000 bill, a relic he carried for emergencies. He placed it on the bedside table. "The change is a tip. You will leave now, and you will ensure Elena Miller's file is flagged for direct contact with my office for all future billing. Do you understand?" The man, wide-eyed, snatched the money and fled. In the sudden quiet, the only sound was the rhythmic pump. Sarah didn't thank him. She turned back to her sister, smoothing her hair. "You don't get to do that," she said, her voice trembling. "You don't get to fire me and then buy your way into my family." "I know about Dr. Vance," David said. "I know about the plan, about Claire." Sarah's shoulders stiffened. "Then you know you ruined it. You ruined the one good thing I was doing." "I didn't know," David said, the defense sounding pathetic even to him. "You didn't want to know." Sarah whirled around, tears finally breaking free. "You saw a maid, a service unit. You didn't see a person. Leo sees more with his fingertips than you do with your cameras and your spreadsheets. He knew I loved him. What's your excuse?" The words hung in the sterile air. David had no answer. He looked at Elena, at the machines keeping her alive, at the sheer cost of Sarah's loyalty. "The hearing is tomorrow," he said, changing the subject because the emotional truth was too vast to confront. "The Domestic Workers Justice Project. You didn't file that." Sarah wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand. "No, they found me. A nurse here knows someone at the organization. They think my case is a perfect test for expanding the Bill of Rights to include emotional care labor. They want to make an example of you." She laughed, a short, bitter sound. "They don't care about me or Leo. They care about the precedent. Just like you didn't care about me, you cared about the anomaly in your accounts." David's phone buzzed. A text from Carl, "Emergency at the house. Leo is distraught. He locked himself in the panic room and won't come out. He's saying he wants Sarah." David's heart stopped. The panic room was a steel-reinforced vault designed for kidnap scenarios. It had air, water, and a dedicated phone line. Leo had never been inside it alone. "It's Leo," David said, his voice cracking. "I have to go." For a split second, Sarah's anger vanished, replaced by pure, unadulterated fear for the child. "What happened?" "He's in the panic room. He won't come out." Without a word, Sarah grabbed her coat. "I'm coming with you." The 90-mile drive back to Bel Air was made in a silence thicker than fog. David broke it once. "Why?" he asked. "Why come back?" Sarah stared out at the dark highway. "Because he's counting steps in a steel box, thinking it's the only safe place left. And I taught him how to find it." When they arrived, the house was lit up like a prison break. 2 private security guards and a terrified housekeeper stood outside the panic room door, which was set into the wall of David's study. The digital keypad was dark. Leo had triggered the manual internal lock. David pressed the intercom. "Leo, it's Dad. Open the door, please." No response. Sarah stepped forward and pressed the button. Leo, it's Sarah, I'm here. I need you to do the sequence. Can you do the sequence for me? Moment of static, then a small, muffled voice. Sarah, you're back. I'm right here, sweetheart. I need you to be brave. Do you remember the sequence? The one we practiced in case of a real emergency? A pause. Then through the door they heard a series of distinct mechanical clicks. Click-lack, click, click-lack, clack. The sound of a small hand working the heavy manual bolts from the inside. Sarah had not just taught him how to get in, she had taught him how to get out. The door swung open. Leo stood there pale, his glasses askew, his hands feeling the air. Sarah knelt and pulled him into a crushing hug. He buried his face in her neck and sobbed. Over Leo's head, Sarah's eyes met David's. In them was no victory, only a devastating verdict. See what you did? David's own son had sought refuge in a vault from the environment he, David, had created. The system had perfectly protected the child from every external threat, and in doing so had made the child a prisoner of it. David ordered everyone out of the study. He, Sarah, and Leo sat on the floor. Leo, exhausted, curled against Sarah, his breathing slowly steadying. "Why did you go in there, Leo?" David asked, his voice gentle. Leo's answer was a whisper. "The house was too quiet, I couldn't hear her steps. I got to 22 and then I didn't know where to go." The path he had memorized led to a void. David looked at Sarah, the woman who had become his son's cardinal direction. "I'm reinstating you," he said, the words leaving his mouth before his boardroom brain could vet them. "Full back pay, a contract, benefits, a proper salary." Sarah shook her head, holding Leo closer. "I don't want your money, David. I want your promise that you will see him, not his condition, him, that you will learn the steps." It was a more terrifying demand than any financial settlement. That moment, David's lawyer Jenkins called. "David, we have a major problem. The Labor Commissioner has fast-tracked the hearing to 9 a.m., and the advocacy group has leaked the story to the press. It's hitting the business blogs right now. Tech titan Thorne accused of exploiting blind son's caregiver. The spin is brutal. They're painting you as a monster who fired the one person connecting your disabled child to the world." David closed his eyes. The story was half true, which made it unstoppable. His company's stock would open down 3, maybe 4%. The board would panic. "We need a strategy for the hearing," Jenkins pressed. "Do we settle? Do we fight?" David looked at Sarah on the floor, at his son, trusting her completely. He looked at the termination letter, still lying on his desk. Fighting meant dragging this woman, her sister, his son's private therapy, and the ghost of his wife through a public tribunal. It meant reducing a profound human failure to legal points. Settling meant writing a check and pretending it never happened. Both were variations of the same old logic: treat the symptom, not the disease. "Tell them we'll be there," David said, "and tell them Sarah Miller will be speaking for herself." He hung up. Sarah stared at him, alarmed. "I don't want to be in a courtroom." "You won't be," David said, a new raw resolve hardening in his voice. "I do not intend to let this get to a hearing." He spent the next 2 hours on the phone, not with lawyers, but with his PR head, his chief of staff, and the head of the Thorne Family Foundation. He gave a series of orders that made no immediate financial sense. He was not planning a defense. He was planning a surrender, a public, total, and transformative surrender. At midnight, he walked Sarah to the guest wing. "Stay tonight, be here for Leo in the morning." She hesitated. "My sister. I've already arranged for a private duty nurse at Havenbrook for the next 48 hours. She's covered." Sarah searched his face, looking for the trap. Finding none, she simply nodded. At 6 a.m., David was in his home office facing a video camera. Carl Renner operated it. David wore a simple black sweater, no tie. He looked exhausted, human. "Are you sure about this, David?" Carl asked. "It's a nuclear option. There's no coming back from it." David nodded. "That's the point." He pressed record. For the next 10 minutes, David Thorne, the billionaire who never apologized, did something the business world had never seen. He confessed. He laid out the facts of Sarah's employment, her secret work with Leo, his own blind arrogance in firing her, and the devastating impact it had on his child. He named Dr. Lydia Vance and honored his late wife's vision. He did not mention the labor complaint. He ended by announcing the immediate, unconditional reinstatement of Sarah Miller with a retroactive salary tripling, full benefits, and a seat on the board of the Thorne Family Foundation's new initiative for children with visual impairments. Then he went further. He announced he was personally funding a $1 million grant to the Domestic Workers Justice Project to establish a legal aid fund for caregivers in similar situations. He was, in effect, funding the army that had been arrayed against him. He posted the video to his company's channel and his personal social media at 7 a.m. By 7:30, it was trending. The narrative flipped from heartless billionaire to a shocking act of corporate contrition. The Labor Commissioner's office called Jenkins at 8, asking if the hearing was still necessary. Jenkins, following David's script, said his client would still attend, but wished to present a ratified settlement for the record. David walked into the hearing room at 9 o'clock with Sarah Miller by his side and his son Leo holding his hand. He did not let his lawyers speak first. He stood and addressed the commissioner directly. "Everything I have to say, I've already said to the public. My only goal here today is to make it legally binding and to ensure that Sarah Miller never has to fear the whims of my ignorance again." By noon it was over. The settlement was ratified. Sarah was officially rehired under the new terms. As they walked out of the building, a swarm of reporters descended. David started to step forward to shield Sarah and Leo, but Sarah touched his arm. She stepped up to the microphones, Leo's hand in hers. She said only one sentence, clear and firm. This wasn't about winning. It was about a little boy who taught a powerful man how to see. Then she turned, took Leo's hand, and walked away, leaving David to face the flashbulbs alone. He looked at the crowd, then back at Sarah and his son getting into a car. For the first time, he understood his role. He was not the center of this story. He was the supporting character who had finally learned his lines, and his next line was to clean up the mess he'd made, starting with the two men who had tried to destroy his family from the outside. Because while he'd been focused on the enemy within, the real threats, Victor Hale and Mason Crowe, had been moving in the shadows, and they were just getting started. The attack came not for David, but for the one piece of leverage his enemies thought he'd never protect. At 2:17 in the morning, David's phone screamed with an alert from the Havenbrook Center's upgraded security system, which his foundation had quietly funded the week before. Motion, room 12, forced entry. David was out of bed before the alert finished chiming. He didn't call security. He called Sarah, who was sleeping down the hall in the guest suite. They're at Havenbrook, they're at Alina's room. He heard her sharp intake of breath, then the sound of her moving. "I'm coming with you." "No, stay with Leo. Lock the panic room protocol. I'm handling this." For the first time, she didn't argue. David drove like a man possessed, Carl Renner on speakerphone coordinating with the private security team already en route. "Two men," Carl said, voice tight. "Matching descriptions of Victor Hale and Mason Crowe. They bypassed the front desk, went straight for the wing. They're inside the room." David's mind raced. Why Alina? To hurt Sarah. To destabilize David's very public, very fragile new alliance. To prove he couldn't protect what mattered. It was a message carved in cruelty. When David's car screeched into the parking lot, he saw the flashing lights of his security team's vehicles already there. He ran inside, past a bewildered night nurse, to room 12. The door was off its hinges. Inside, the scene was both better and worse than he feared. Victor Hale, a gaunt man in a dark windbreaker, was pinned against the wall by two of David's guards. Mason Crowe was on his knees, hands behind his head. Alina lay undisturbed in her bed, the feeding pump still rhythmically clicking, but on the pillow next to her head was a single, stark white envelope. David didn't look at the men, he looked at the envelope. He put on gloves, picked it up, and slid out a single sheet of paper. It was a photograph, a grainy, long-lens shot of Sarah, taken just that afternoon, walking with Leo in the garden of David's home. A red circle was drawn around Leo's small figure. The message was clear: we can always get closer. David turned to Victor Hale. The man sneered. "Visiting hours over, Thorne. We were just paying our respects to the poor, sick sister of your beloved charity case." David said nothing. He walked to the bedside, checked Alina's monitors himself. Steady, unharmed, they hadn't touched her, they'd used her as a drop box. The violation was psychological, designed to terrify Sarah. It was working. David's phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. "Is she safe?" David typed back, "She's safe. They're contained, I promise." He looked at the two men being handcuffed. "Call the police," he told Carl, "but first, put them in the van. I want 5 minutes." In the back of the armored security van, with the engine running, David faced Victor and Mason. They were smug, confident in the rules of engagement. "You have nothing," Mason spat. "Trespassing at best. We didn't lay a finger on the vegetable." David remained calm. He pulled out his phone, opened a file, and began to read. October 12, 2021. A $200,000 wire from Shell Company, Veritas Holdings, to a dormant account linked to the campaign of City Councilman Ruiz for favorable zoning on the downtown project you were trying to sink. Victor's smirk faltered. David continued. March 3, 2022. An encrypted email from a server registered to Mason Crow detailing a plan to plant falsified safety inspection reports at my manufacturing plant in Nevada. He looked up. I've had a file on you for years, I just never used it. I considered you a cost of doing business, a nuisance. He leaned forward. But you made this personal, you threatened a child, you terrorized a woman who has already lost everything. That changes the math. David nodded to Carl, who stood by the open van door. Carl held up a second tablet, playing video footage. It showed Victor and Mason earlier that night meeting with a third man in a parking garage. The man exchanged a briefcase for a small, dark object. A gun. The license plate of the third man's car was clearly visible. That's arms trafficking, David said quietly. Federal, 10-year minimum. Your associate is already in custody, and he's very chatty. The color drained from both men's faces. Their calculated trespassing had just been upstaged by a felony David had allowed them to walk into. He had baited the trap with Alina's safety, and they had taken the bait whole. The police are outside, David said, standing. You can talk to them about trespassing, or you can wait for the federal agents who are about to arrive, your choice. He stepped out of the van. The local police took custody, reading them their rights for the minor charge. David watched, his expression unreadable. As the patrol car pulled away, an unmarked sedan glided into the lot. Two federal agents approached David, showed their badges. He handed them the tablet. Everything you need is there. The digital chain is pristine. He didn't stay to watch the second arrest. He went back inside, sat with Alina until the sun came up, holding the hand of a woman who would never know he was there. When David returned home, Sarah was waiting in the kitchen, her eyes red-rimmed. Leo was asleep on the sofa, a braille book open on his chest. They're gone, David said. They won't be coming back, not ever. Sarah didn't ask for details. She just nodded, the tension leaving her shoulders in a slow sigh. Thank you, she whispered. It was the first time she had thanked him for anything. The weeks that followed were a quiet revolution. Sarah moved back into her quarters, but now with a formal contract, a salary that stunned her into silence, and the title of Director of Sensory Learning for the Thorn Foundation. Dr. Lydia Vance came to the house twice a week, working with both Sarah and Leo, and finally with David. He learned Braille slowly, painfully. His fingers, used to typing on glass, struggled to distinguish the dots. Leo would sit beside him, patiently getting his father's hand. That's an A, Dad. It feels like a period, but lower. One afternoon, David was in the attic, finally properly archiving his wife's things with Sarah's help. They found a box labeled Leo's Future in Claire's flowing script. Inside were more than books. There were detailed notes, letters to Leo for milestones she knew she'd miss, and a sealed envelope addressed to the Guardian. Sarah's hands trembled as she opened it. It was a letter from Claire, written just weeks before her death. To whoever is reading this, you are the guardian of my greatest treasure. I see his light, even if his eyes cannot. I have tried to build a world for him that is not defined by absence, but by different kinds of presence. If you are here, it means you have seen him too. Thank you for walking the path I could not finish. With all my love, Claire. Sarah cried. David sat beside her on the dusty floor, the letter between them. It was the final piece of the puzzle. Sarah hadn't just been fulfilling a promise. She had been chosen, anointed by a mother's love, to complete a sacred task. David finally understood the magnitude of what he had almost lost. 6 months later, the Thorn Foundation launched its first flagship program, the Claire Whittaker Thorn Sensory Literacy Initiative. The press event was held not in a boardroom, but in the renovated library of David's home, now filled with tactile art and braille books open to the public. Leo, wearing a small suit, stood beside his father. David spoke briefly, then yielded the podium to Sarah. She spoke about access, about dignity, about the silent labor of care. Then she did something unexpected. She called Leo forward. My co-teacher has something to share, she said. Leo stepped to the microphone, his small hands finding the edges of the podium. He took a deep breath. My name is Leo Thorn, this is my house, and I want to read you the first page of my favorite book. He placed his fingertips on a braille page and began to read aloud, his voice clear and strong in the silent room. The knight could not see the dragon with his eyes, so he learned to feel its heat on the stone and hear the shift of its scales in the dark. He realized the darkness was not his enemy, it was his map. The room erupted in applause. David watched, his vision blurring, as his son stood confidently in a spotlight he himself had once thought was a prison. After the event, as guests mingled, David pulled Sarah aside. "I'm transferring the deed of the beach house in Malibu to you," he said. "It's single-level, wheelchair-accessible. It has a guest cottage perfect for live-in nursing care. I want you to bring Alina home, Sarah, to a real home. The foundation will cover all her medical needs." "For life." Sarah stared at him, speechless. It was more than money. It was the return of her family. She could only nod, tears streaming down her face. That evening, David sat with Leo in his room. The boy was tracing a new, complex braille diagram. "What are you reading now?" David asked. Leo smiled. "Architectural plans. Sarah says I'm helping design the new children's wing for the institute. She says I know what walls feel like better than anyone." David's heart swelled. His son was not being sheltered from the world. He was being equipped to build a better one. The final surprising detail came from an audit of the old household accounts. David's new accountant found a recurring annual donation, paid every year on Claire's birthday, to the Havenbrook Center. It was for exactly $4,800, the exact amount of Sarah's yearly payments for her sister's supplemental care. Claire had been anonymously covering Alina's costs through a donor-advised fund, ensuring Sarah could afford to stay and care for Leo. David had never known. The system, even in his wife's death, had been providing. He just hadn't been reading the reports. David closed the ledger. He walked to the window and looked out at the garden, where Sarah and Leo were walking, her hand on his shoulder, his head tilted up toward the sun. The machine was finally running as intended, not with cold efficiency, but with warmth, with connection, with love. He had fired the maid to preserve a system, and in doing so had been forced to become the man his wife always believed he could be, not a controller but a protector, not a boss but a father. The crisis was over. The threats were gone, and for the first time in years, the house was not quiet. It was full of the sound of a future being built, step by careful step, by hands that had learned to see in the dark. So what is the true value of work that happens in the dark? Not just at night, but in the unseen, uncelebrated spaces of our lives. For David Thorne, it was measured in the quiet confidence of a son who no longer feared the silence. For Sarah Miller, it was measured in the ability to finally bring her sister home. We live in a world that prizes visible productivity, the signed deal, the public gesture, the measurable result. But this story forces us to ask, what are we missing in the shadows? The legal framework for domestic workers, those 2.2 million people who care for our homes and our most vulnerable, is still a patchwork. The exclusions written into law nearly a century ago cast a long shadow. We design systems for efficiency, but true care is inherently inefficient. It cannot be fully scheduled, quantified, or automated. It exists in the extra minute, the remembered detail, the silent vigil. David Thorne learned that the hardest way, by almost destroying the very thing he was trying to preserve. We are all in some way David Thorne. We make quick judgments based on job titles, on appearances, on the limited data our own biases allow us to see. We confuse authority with wisdom and wealth with strength. But what if the most powerful person in the room is the one who speaks the least, yet hears everything? What if the real guardian is not the one who holds the key, but the one who teaches you how to find the lock? This story isn't about a millionaire's redemption. It's about a recalibration of sight. Leo, the blind child, was the only one who truly saw Sarah's worth from the beginning because he was using a different metric, one of consistency, of safety, of tactile truth. In a culture obsessed with the visual, with surfaces and screens, his perception was superior. He was reading the world in Braille while the rest of us were skimming the headline. The lingering question isn't whether David Thorne became a better man. It's whether we, as a society, can learn to value the labor that doesn't come with a time card. Can we build systems that protect the Sarah Millers, not as an afterthought, but as the essential infrastructure they are? Can we learn to listen to the Leo Thornes among us, the ones who perceive the tremors in the foundation long before the walls crack? Every family, every company, every community has its secret keepers, the people who do the emotional heavy lifting, the crisis prevention, the invisible maintenance that keeps everything from falling apart. They rarely have the loudest voice or the biggest office. They are the maids, the nurses, the assistants, the caregivers, and their work done in the dark is often the only thing holding the light together. So look around your own life. Who is the person you've categorized by their function? Who is the voice you've stopped hearing because you think you already know what they'll say? What unseen act of care is happening right under your roof every night that you have mistaken for something else? The most profound transformations don't begin with grand gestures. They begin with a moment of truly seeing someone you've looked at 1,000 times and realizing you've never actually seen them at all. If this story made you reconsider the architecture of your own world, if it made you look twice at the quiet guardian in your life, then it has done its job. These are the narratives that don't just entertain, they rewire. They remind us that compassion is not a soft skill. It is the ultimate strategic advantage. And sometimes, the only way to find your way is to close your eyes and let your hands learn to read the map. Thank you for watching. If you want more stories that challenge what you think you see, hit subscribe, because the world is full of secrets waiting for the right person to listen.